Welcome to the second event in our series of Wednesday professional development workshops for the 2020 Leadership Alliance summer programming. I'm Dr. Will Whittles. I'm the manager for undergraduate and graduate programs here at the Leadership Alliance. I will be the moderator for today's event. This event is a component of the Leadership Alliance Virtual Professional Development Program. Leadership Alliance partners created this initiative to ensure continuity of skill building, networking, and exposure to graduate programs for students from across the country. Paired with our Monday evening Conversations with the Doctoral Scholars series, we hope to provide you with a platform for discussion of critical issues, networking with each other and our wonderful doctoral scholars, as well as for learning approaches and skills for navigating your research careers. This series would not be possible without the work of my colleagues here at Brown University, Chaminade University in Honolulu, Weill Cornell Medical College, and Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. To those colleagues, thank you for your efforts in creating this program. Today, we will be talking about the responsible conduct of research, or RCR, and research ethics. Many of you have probably been exposed to some responsible conduct of research training already, and all of you who go to graduate school will certainly be exposed to as well, and that's across the disciplines. This session is an opportunity to get a jump start on this material while also placing it in a larger context of research ethics, the role of research in society, and how the research enterprise can reckon with its past and present exploitation of marginalized peoples. Joined by four wonderful scholars in today's panel, I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. Dr. Karen Brackey, PhD, is professor of psychology at Belmont College in Atlanta, Georgia. She earned her PhD in psychological sciences from Georgia State University in 1996. Trained as a comparative developmental scientist, Dr. Brackey has research experience working with both humans and non-human species, primarily examining early cognitive and motor development. She served for many years on the Atlanta University Center's Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, and continues to serve as a 20-year member of Spelman College's Institutional Review Board, having the role of co-chair for 8 of those years. Dr. Brackey has taught research ethics through multiple courses and research training programs and serves as a consultant on related matters for her campus colleagues. Dr. Janet Cross received an undergraduate degree from the State University of New York College at Fredonia, and her PhD in molecular biology and microbiology from Case Western Reserve University. She moved to the University of Virginia in 2002 as a postdoctoral fellow and is currently associate professor of medical education and pathology there. She has been heavily involved in the educational mission of the School of Medicine, contributing to the creation of the Molecular and Cellular Basis of Defense graduate program, and serving as its director for 10 years. She's a gifted teacher who was recognized in 2011 with a Dean's Excellent Teaching Award and induction into the Academy of Distinguished Educators. From 2015 to 2020, Dr. Cross served as the Assistant Dean for Graduate Research and Training for the Biomedical Sciences Graduate Program. Among her many responsibilities in this role, she directed summer research programs for undergraduate and medical students and spearheaded the diversity recruitment efforts for graduate programs. From 2015 to 2019, Dr. Cross oversaw the responsible conduct of research programming for all trainees in the School of Medicine, with training for summer students, as well as the graduate students, postdocs, clinical fellows, nursing students, and young faculty. Prior to moving into the assistant dean position full-time, Dr. Cross ran an active research program focused predominantly on cell signaling and the immune tumor microenvironment in breast cancer, where she mentored several graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. She continues to provide scientific guidance to trainees through her academic advising and service on nearly 30 current graduate student and postdoctoral advisory committees. On June 1st, Dr. Cross became the Associate Dean for the Graduate and Medical Scientist programs, where she will continue to shape the graduate training environment in the School of Medicine. Dr. Volker M. Vogt is a professor in the Department of Molecular Biology and Genetics at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. His lab has studied the assembly of retroviruses, the best known example of which is HIV, for some 40 years. The lab uses biochemistry, molecular biology, cell biology, and structural biology in their research. He has taught a variety of courses over many years at Cornell, most recently focusing on cell biology. Volker has a long-standing commitment to diversity in higher education in STEM fields. 7 years ago, he launched a diversity-focused summer REU program in molecular biology and genetics, which is now in part associated with the Leadership Alliance and receives support from the National Science Foundation. He has also played a major role in yearly graduate student and also undergraduate student research ethics training at Cornell. Dr. Alicia Beckford-Wasink. Alicia Beckford-Wasink is an associate professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Linguistics. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan in 1999. She has directed the Sociolinguistics Laboratory at UW for 15 years. Wasink was Ronald McNair Faculty Mentor of the Year in 2001, nominated for an Excellence in Teaching Award in 2007, and an affiliate professor in the Center for Mind, Brain, and Learning at the University of Washington, which is now known as iLabs. She's an external examiner at the University of West Indies in Mona, Kingstown, Jamaica. Wasink is a former Howard and Francis Nostrand Endowed Professor of Language and Cultural Competence. Her research interests lie in the acoustic dynamics of vowel systems, ethnic dialect-related bias in speech recognition systems, social network modeling, dialect contact, and phonological variation in Jamaican Creole. Her commitment to public scholarship is exemplified in her recent work on racial bias in automatic speech recognition systems, which was presented at the American Academy for the Advancement of Science and drew the attention of National Public Radio. Her 2014 radio interview on Seattle's KUOW was ranked the #1 story for that year and has subsequently been re-aired. Other appearances include KNKX and KBCS Radio and King 5 and Kiro TV. She is committed to the advancement of research methods and data sharing within the linguistics community. Her laboratory website provides a portal for linguists to access recordings and transcripts from her multi-year Pacific Northwest English study, including computer scripts for data analysis. Her laboratory developed and hosts CLOX, C-L-O-X, which stands for Client Laboratories Oxford, an automatic speech recognition tool for the automated transcription of free-flowing speech. For the public, she uses innovative tools such as an audio quiz, local history from a sociolinguistics eye view, and interactive dialect maps. So like I said, 4 fabulous scholars, fabulous teachers, and I think we're gonna have a really good discussion. I'm gonna kick it off with the first question, which I'm gonna ask each of our panelists to answer in that same alphabetical order. So we'll start with Dr. Brackey. And the first question is, what is responsible conduct of research? And why is it important for social justice?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Will, and I'm glad to be here, and I want to just applaud all the students for participating in this program this summer and taking advantage of the opportunity. So responsible conduct of research means basically research integrity and ethical conduct, and it comprises a number of different aspects of research. Everything from being honest in how you collect and report data, to how you treat your participants, human participants or animal subjects, ethically. And maintaining the process of research in a way that is honest and objective and that will contribute to the general body of knowledge that we have. So there's a lot of different things that we could talk about. And the second part of the question is, how does it relate to social justice? Again, there's a lot of different ways, right? Because the aim of science is to improve social conditions and to give us knowledge, generalizable knowledge, that is reliable, that will help us live better lives and improve conditions on the planet, if you will. And that includes improving life for everyone. And again, there's many, many different ways that this can relate to research, to social justice. You know, one of the main points and that I think we all think of, and so since I'm going first, is looking at the Belmont report. All right, so I know many of you have read it. Some of you may have not. If you haven't, I recommend reading it. For a government document, it's quite eloquent and lays out principles of working with human participants in a very social justice oriented framework. It talks about the pillars: beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. And particularly the section on justice is very, very relevant and very prescient. It foreshadows a lot of what we're talking about today. I could go into more, but I want to make sure my colleagues have a chance to speak. So that's sort of a general introduction. And if I have any more thoughts later on, I will tag them on after my colleagues speak.
Thank you, Dr. Brackey. Dr. Cross.
All right, thank you, Will. So despite my introduction and all of the different titles I've held over the course of my career, I am at heart and always will be a cancer biologist. And so in the context of that work, I've dealt predominantly with the NIH definitions of what responsible conduct of research means, which is many of the things that my fellow panelists mentioned. But it's very easy as a basic science researcher who has very little contact with frank human subjects research to kind of put blinders on and say, if I'm always working with samples in a test tube or with cells in a dish, I'm not really doing human subjects research, or I'm not really, you know, connected to that aspect of things that are covered in the Belmont report. And I think it's only in recent years that we've all come to appreciate that everything is interconnected. And that includes everything from making sure that your basic science wet bench cells in a dish type research is rigorous and reproducible so that other people don't try to follow on and devise therapies that are based on inaccurate, misleading, or otherwise not reproducible data, up to ensuring that clinical trials include patients from all walks of life and from all racial and ethnic minorities, and that everyone is represented, so that we're confident that when we put a therapy out into the community, that it is going to be equally efficacious for everyone, or at least that we understand the ways that it won't. And so I think that one of the things that I try to keep in mind is that even when we are working, you know, at the most very basic levels to understand biology, that it's important to realize that it's that foundation on which those future therapies are going to be built. And so ensuring that we're doing that research in the, you know, the most rigorous way, that we're being honest and ethical in the way we conduct that research. A lot of cancer biology depends on animal models, making sure that the animals are well cared for and humanely handled. All of these things are really important and feed into the concept of responsible conduct of research. But the ultimate goal that we're all working towards is trying to develop new and better therapeutics, at least in the biomedical sciences arena, for a variety of diseases. And I think that, you know, it's been recently that we've come to appreciate how much the work that we're doing does impact on social justice aspects. I think the final thing that I will add is that I do live in a school of medicine, and of course, health disparities is a major focus of many of my colleagues. I've spent a great deal of time with colleagues who focus on how we can ensure equal access to healthcare for all. And so I think that rolling some aspects of that into our appreciation of what is ethical and responsible conduct of research is important to consider. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dr. Cross. Dr. Vogt.
Yes, so my background is very similar to Janet's, and haven't exactly worked on cancer, but you know, cell biology, molecular biology, HIV, and things. So I just want to step back step back farther from a bird's eye view. So ethics, what is ethics? You guys out there listening, you many students, ethics is the sort of the principles of correct behavior, and it's learned, of determining proper behavior. It's something learned. It's not innate, with a few exceptions. It's not innate, and so you're here to learn what these rules are in science that we've come across. We, meaning the community of scientists all over the world. So my comments are going to be directed mostly to those of you doing molecular cell biology, sort of tissue culture kind of experiments, not with people. And so, as Janet alluded to, the NIH and NSF have these several categories, 8 or 9 different categories: research in human subjects, animals, you know, peer review, collaborations. And one of those, the only one I'm going to use as a segue very briefly, is called research misconduct. So you all know, you listeners, what that means. It means, hey, faking it, cheating. It means doing something wrong, making up data, or modifying data in an inappropriate way. And so I don't want to talk a lot about that. I just want to use it as a segue, as I'll tell you in a minute. So my introduction to this was actually 40 years ago, almost to the day, to the week. 40 years, that's, you know, some of your parents, you students, weren't even alive then. So I was involved in a famous scandal. It was probably one of the best known cheating episodes in science in the second half of the 20th century. So life thrusts us into these situations we have to deal with. I got a lot of credit. I don't actually deserve the credit because I was the guy who found this cheater out. But he had people, he had a Nobel Prize winner wrapped around his finger, famous people. And it was just awful in a way. It was a fascinating story. But you know, that's 40 years ago. Maybe you can't learn too much from that. But my point now is a segue. This is my main thing to talk about. So science, this kind of science I'm talking, it recovers. So it was set back by this cheater who made up these data. And, you know, it was in the early days of cancer, molecular biology of cancer. Everyone thought this is the true clue of cancer. This was amazing stuff. It's all made up, it turns out. All right, but science recovers because the science, experimental science, sort of corrects itself. It has a built-in mechanism, because if you publish something and it's wrong and people can't reproduce it, then it's forgotten. And if it's not interesting, it'll also be forgotten. So we publish in order to move the proverbial frontiers of science forward. And if you publish, you obligate yourself to share your resources that you use, not only in words, but also in you know, reagents, plasmids, or whatever you built, and antibodies. And if you don't do that, then you're hounded out. So you can't continue. So what I want to leave you students with is this kind of a vision. I'm kind of being a preacher here, I guess, but the vision is that science builds bridges. It's international. It doesn't matter whether you live in, you know, and grew up in, you know, in Beijing or Sao Paulo or Paris or San Francisco. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're especially in this decade. Man, some of these things mattered before. Your gender, your race doesn't matter. Whether you're black or brown or Asian, or what your culture is. All those things, science is a universal language, and we share it. And so what I want to leave you as a vision is that if we, meaning you guys who are inheriting the science, not me, I'm phasing out pretty soon, I'm too old. And so use some of these principles that work so well in experimental science and apply them to other aspects of life, like the things that fragment our society. It's terrible. We live in this fragmented society, as you all know, where people throw eggs at each other, or much worse. Science doesn't have a red or a blue political flavor. It doesn't have a color. It's really universal. It builds bridges among people. So use that as a vision, and you will help in your lifetimes build a better a better social justice and a better society. Okay, that's my comment.
Thanks, Dr. Vogt. Dr. Wasink, and would you like me to bring up the slide?
I would, thank you. If you could put
Sure.
up the one with the spectrogram.
Yes. Let me move forward. There's some Belmont report. By the way, for all you students out there, the Belmont report has been posted in the professional development classroom. I encourage you all to read it. It's really useful. Is this the spectrogram, Dr. Wasson?
This is, thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Will. Welcome, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you. I wanted to start with this slide just to kind of give you an idea of the kind of research that I do, the level at which I work, because a lot of people don't know what linguistics is. And I think I first need to make the point that it's not a language learning centered discipline like French literature and language or Spanish studies. Linguistics is the scientific study of the human capacity for language. And so what we learn about is how the brain is special when it comes to things like symbolic reasoning or the processing of speech sounds, how the articulators work to help us produce speech, how languages are signed. And I, within that, am a sociophonetician. And what that means is that I work on explaining the socially structured variation in the sound systems of human languages. So my bread and butter is this thing that you see in front of you, a sound spectrogram. And what we look at are the ways that dialects and languages have unique acoustic profiles. And so I have spectrograms here that represent two of the underrepresented language varieties that I work with, African American English and Yakima. Some of the work that I do occurs on the traditional tribal lands of the Yakima people in South Central Washington. And what we look at are similarities and differences in what are called formants for vowels and other acoustic events for consonants. And so as you can see here, a formant is like a concentration of acoustic energy around some frequency in the speech signal. So the point of this graphic is really to show you that in some ways, this doesn't look like human-centered research, right? And so we're looking at the mathematical properties of speech and trying to understand how human languages have similar properties and where these properties are different. And so as a sociophonetician, I can see like 7 or 8 differences between the graphs that you see on the top and the bottom of the screen. And I spend a lot of time teaching my students how to recognize these. So we really spend time in what can come to be a disembodied view of language. And so the first point that I really want to make is that a lot of times when we're doing science, we kind of take several steps back. And my job as a principal investigator is to kind of put the human and the human community back into the research. And so, Will, if you will go to the RCR questions slide. I think following up on a number of points that my colleagues have already made, I could kind of sum up the way that I put the human back into the research that I do. I have to think about these Belmont principles of respect for persons, for example, in thinking about how I represent the languages or dialects that are my objects of study. I need to give some thought to what I am doing, how I, as an analyst, group people into language groupings or dialect groupings and the ways that I'm representing them. So in the case of a lot of Native American languages, the tendency of history has been very harmful. We have tended to look at them in terms of what forms they're losing as native speakers die out and people aren't learning them anymore. This is kind of what's been called an endangerment framework. But if I am equally representing all human languages on the way to understanding the human capacity for language, I'm going to do basic research that allows for any language variety to have an equal chance of being studied. If I want to understand how brain potentials work with regard to understanding noun phrases, I'm going to do that for Native American languages, for African American English, for Asian American varieties. I won't just look at how they're exotic or how they're different. I will also think about how I categorize my subjects. Sometimes analyst categories, or the categories of the US Census, do not match how subjects self-identify. And so I have to think about the moral responsibility that I have to categorize my subjects in a way that actually is faithful to their understandings of their communities. I have to think about what my research priorities are. In the sciences, we define research questions, and we have very specific data structures that we use to be able to respond to those. Well, my cares about language may be different from those of the communities that I work in. So in the 20 years that I've been doing research, I've come to also ask what the research priorities might be that researchers in the local host communities where I do that research, what they care about. And then finally, what are the ethical principles that I adhere to, and whose are they? So the National Science Foundation does lay out basic ethical principles. The Belmont report, which my university holds me to as a PI, lays out basic principles as well. But my tribal community, the Yakama Tribal Council, also has guidelines for ethical conduct of research. And in the process of doing my work, I've learned that all of those don't necessarily lead me to the same types of research priorities. And I am actually going to choose to adhere to all of them. So at the end of the day, what I try to practice is called culturally responsive research. Here's another acronym for you now, CRR. We're talking about RCR, and this is CRR. But CRR recognizes that culture is central to the research process. And it invites researchers to be aware of the cultural standpoints, both of the researcher or their funding institution, their university, as well as the cultural standpoints of the research community in conducting their research. And this is following on what's called multiculturally valid research, which was spelled out by a number of researchers, but Kirkhart and Obama Henente in 2010. So these are fundamentally what guides my research. Thanks, Will.
Dr.
That's it for the slides.
Thank you. I'm actually going to keep you up, though, for the next question. Do you want the slides to stay up?
Oh, sure. Yes.
Because you're up for the next, you and Dr. Brackey are going to be responding to the next question. And that question is, does the research community owe reparations to historically marginalized people that it's exploited? If so, what might that look like?
Wow, that's fantastic. So if you want to move to the next slide. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the Belmont principles for the ethical conduct of research, and I just want to draw on the first of those, which is respect of persons, and talk a little bit about what reparations are and how we want to actually observe our responsibilities as ethically operating researchers within this. Early in my research in the Yakima Valley, and I want to recognize the fact that I'm actually here at the invitation of Heritage University, which is a university on traditional Yakima tribal lands. Early in my research in that community, I learned that there was a curriculum for research ethics called the R-Ethics curriculum. You can kind of see the logo for it in the top right-hand side of the screen. That my institution, the University of Washington, didn't actually know about. I was very interested in making sure that I do culturally responsive research. And the Tribal Council gave me these guidelines so that my research team went through a separate IRB process above and beyond what the University of Washington required. I think that one of the ways that I learned about what reparations need to look like for linguistic research came as I was preparing this curriculum. Because harm and what looks like harm in a specific research context is not something that's going to be specifically spelled out by my funding agency or even by my university. I learned about harm and what has constituted harm by studying the guidelines for research with American Indian and Alaska Native communities given to me by the Tribal Council. So ethical research, this curriculum spells out as recognizing that harm can result from the history of research in Indian country, not just from the research that I'm doing right now. This is the idea that as I enter a community, I need to be aware of their history with scientists and understand what that means for the research, for the impacts of research on that community historically. So just with respect to the first one of these, respect of persons, the first of the Belmont principles, in an American Indian context, science has sometimes neglected to recognize that people have a keen sense of their tribal and their kinship responsibility. We tend to think that when we're giving an individual a consent form, asking if they want to participate in our research, that they're seeing themselves as participating only on their own behalf. But that is not necessarily the case in a lot of tribal communities where people are participating out of a sense of familial obligation, or they're very aware that they're involving other people in their community. So in linguistic research, historically, and the anthropologist Eugene Hun has a book looking at the treatment of tribal groups in the lower Columbia River Valley in Washington State. One of the historic harms that he recognizes is that scientists studying language came in and recorded stories being produced by tribal people. But those cultures hold sacred even the name of their language. So there are different names for the local community's languages, and those names are not to be shared outside of the local community. So taking stories, taking language names, recording them, sharing the data without permission is a very deep cultural harm that was done by earlier research. And recognizing this, I have to be very careful what name I even use for representing the traditional heritage language of the Yakima people. Another example was that from 1973 to 1976, 3,500 women in this part of the country were sterilized by the Indian Health Service. And so without their permission had research done to them and treatments administered that happened without their understanding of benefits and risks. So for me, reparations look like being very aware of the ways that I'm using language and how honest I'm being with regard to what my purposes of research, what the research protocols are, giving people the opportunity to withdraw from the research at any time, and after the research is done to be able to be debriefed. But there's a further step that I've taken, and if, Will, you'd put up my last slide, I'll just briefly say, one more, the one that says public engagement project. Right, so one step that I'm taking in my current research, and this is actually something that my research grant has money for, is to practice what's called in my field linguistic gratuity, which means returning linguistic favors that the community does for us, doing linguistically important research from their point of view as well. So returning favors to the host research community. This takes the form of a small amount of money included in my grant for community members to design a small-scale study that they want to use to address an issue of concern to them using my study data. So we have held a competition that allows proposers from the local community to demonstrate a topic of value locally, identify a research question, identify some data that they can use to address the research question, go through the whole scientific process. And these people become part of my local research team. An example of this would be, we use ultrasound tongue imaging to look at how the tongue body is actually conformed during speech. One of the concerns that I've learned exists in the Yakima Valley is that speech language pathologists who serve the local community don't actually know what baselines to use for healthy or normative speech among the Yakima people. So one project is taking some of our ultrasound data and actually creating baselines for what healthy articulation looks like for speech language pathologists in the local valley. And after the study is done, they get to keep that data. It is in fact partly theirs. And they will also be offered co-authorship status on any publications that come out of the research. So for me, that's repair. That's giving back to the community something that recognizes their own interests in research, that recognizes the ways that language is a social issue for them, and gives back in the terms of linguistic gratuity. So that's what reparations would look like in a meaningful way for a linguistic project.
Thank you, Dr. Wassink. Dr. Brackey.
Okay, well, I think those are beautiful examples of ways to incorporate reparations as you go. And that's really what the spirit of research is, that you're weighing costs and benefits as you go and make sure that the benefits at either individual or communal levels outweigh the risks that are being taken by those individuals and their communities when they participate. I'll just add a few points that I thought of along the way, more kind of a general, not with respect to any particular research project, and I'll try to be quick about it. But I am interestingly enough, in the ethical principles, I've noticed some places are starting to incorporate respect for communities in addition to respect for persons. And that's sort of incorporating this idea that we want to not just look at the individuals, but we want to look at what's happening. And I think Dr. Wassink's example is a beautiful, a very nice example of that. In particular, I'm looking at the ethical guidelines for the PLOS One journal that has respect for communities. So if you want to look at that language, just look at PLOS One's ethical principles. And again, reparations for past research, they're certainly the example that many of us know very prominently is for the Tuskegee syphilis study, where reparations were eventually secured for participants and their survivors, their families, both in terms of cash amounts. I think each, at the time, those who had survived, I think the amount was about $170,000 to each individual, and then $1,000 to each individual, and then surviving spouses and offspring received a lesser amount of cash. There are still a few surviving offspring who are receiving that cash, or receiving, well, not the cash, but the other part of that was healthcare, medical care, healthcare. And there are still a few surviving offspring who are receiving medical care for life. So in terms of, what reparations would look like, I think the healthcare, particularly in the kinds of research we're talking about, medical care, healthcare, and of course cash is a consideration. For psychological research, make sure that there is counseling available if needed for individuals. For community, so you want to have the individual level for participants, but also the community level. And the community level you know, certainly as Tuskegee shows us, I think scientists feel like it is appropriate if harm can be demonstrated, and identify who it is that's affected. And the larger you go out from the individuals, it can be a little harder to do that, and it gets caught up with more general arguments for reparations from governments and other systemic processes. So I think it's an interesting question. I think that ethically, you know, and ethics is a consensus of agreement among a community. I think over the decades, we've seen greater and greater support for that kind of concern for communities. And I'm guessing greater support for reparations. I think making those reparations happen, even when it's identified, kind of is a whole nother conversation, and can get caught up in a lot of bureaucratic and administrative networks that can make it difficult, particularly the longer time has passed and the broader the potential repercussions have come. I'm going to leave it at that. Again, I want to make sure we get to the other questions.
Thanks, Dr. Bracke. One final prepared question, and then we'll move to audience questions. And this question is for Drs. Cross and Vogt. What advice would you give to your undergraduate self with respect to responsible conduct of research?
So you want me to start alphabetically? So I'm a first-gen college student. And so when I was an undergrad and sitting in the seats that you're sitting in now, I had never thought about any of these topics. As someone who was scientifically interested and did well in my science classes, there was this inherent assumption that I was going to go to medical school because that was the career path that my family understood. That, you know, there was no concept. No one in my family had even completed a bachelor's degree, to say nothing of a PhD. And so these were just not things that were a part of my community. When I decided I wanted to do research, the first time I was exposed to this material was as a first-year graduate student. And as I said, at that point, I was going to be working with test tubes and cells in a dish. And so I didn't really see how a lot of this information was going to impact my trajectory. But I was so mistaken, because as I said in my introduction, many of these things did influence even my research at that level. And then when I was a postdoctoral fellow, my research took a strange turn, and I had to become more oriented towards a tumor immunology study. And for those of you who are interested in immunology, it's almost impossible to do that kind of research without working with animal models. And so at that point, I had to familiarize myself with all of the ethical concepts around the use of animals in experimentation. And later, I began to work with some human tissues in my research. And so there was a whole new amount of work and knowledge that I had to gain about how my research in human tissues related to human subjects related concepts. And so I think my take-home advice for you is that, and I'll give you a second to think about this, what is the number one criteria that predisposes people to getting cancer, right? I'm a cancer biologist. And for those of you who came up with the answer of age, you're absolutely right. The same thing is true for encountering something that will require you to have this knowledge and responsible conduct of research and research ethics. At some point in your career, you will run into some situation or be involved in some scenario where the knowledge and the exposure to this information that you're getting now is important. Volker pointed out that he, encountered something like this as a young scientist. It will happen at some point in your career. So I would encourage you to engage with this content now, wrestle with these concepts, think deeply about the content, the ramifications, the types of things that you've heard a bit about today. Engage with them now so that when you do encounter that that experience, that scenario, that situation that you need to be able to respond to, you will have the equipment and the knowledge that you need to do so.
Thanks, Dr. Cross. Dr. Vogt?
Yeah, I just want to say again to you undergrads who are listening, you will have seen already now that research means many different things. Research, so the research I was talking about, trying to idealize it, that's research on without any human subjects involved. So the questions are different, but at some basic level they're similar. So so I have here a little note to myself: when you join a lab, what should you be aware of? And I echo what my colleague just said, who was in cancer biology. First thing is listen attentively to whoever it is. Listen, take notes, keep a careful notebook. That's more in the realm of science than RCR, but it's related. It's RCR, and really important. Never be afraid to ask. Whether you're asking your immediate mentor, for you undergrads, often in my field, typically as a senior grad student or a postdoc, or your PI, professor, whoever it is. ask questions. If you're you're sure about something, I'm not sure about who's the author on publications. I know at Cornell, all the undergrads want to be authors in publications. So that there's a microenvironment there. My lab may be different than someone else's, but ask about it ahead of time. Ask about what the expectations are, what background you're expected to learn on your own, and so on. If there are disagreements, to whom should you figure out, to whom you should turn? There's a whole hierarchy of people. That's the one thing you learn. Okay, and then this is more generalized. This is my preaching, I guess. Trust your mentors. Yes, in life, if you trust people, sometimes it will happen. You will trust people who, screw you in one way or another. But overall, it's the best, as far as I can see, the best advice in life is to trust people wherever possible. Just do it, because that will promote goodwill, and it will move you forward in your career. So even if they can't answer all the questions, trust their advice, then seek other advice. And then this is in the realm of human relationships, applies to everyone. Be polite. Be polite and expect the same of your mentors. If they have a Nobel Prize, doesn't matter. Everyone needs to be polite. Hold them to it. And then I'm near the end of my thing here. Be aware that in science, and this is all kinds of science, test tube science, cell biology, human, animal work, there are many styles, and the styles are ways to run the lab. They vary by the person's own background, the PI's background. So accept that and try to pick a lab if you have that choice. Pick a lab or pick a group that you will feel comfortable in. That's not always easy to do for undergrads. And finally here, when you start your work, don't be put off if you set on a project that sounds menial. That's where a lot of work starts in life. You learn the techniques by doing menial work. That's normal, it's appropriate, but you want to graduate from that. And then last point is, this is not about RCR, but it's about science. You have to be successful to be rewarded internally by your work. You need to have a high tolerance for failure. Hey man, this is the way it is. It's slow. It's more difficult than you think. You can't write a Scientific American article every year. Have a high tolerance and you'll do fine. Okay, that's my few comments.
Thanks, Dr. Vogt. So we had a question that came in before, that was submitted via the Google Classroom. So we'll read that one first, and then we'll get to the others. So this first question is, reading the Belmont report, and a couple of you who have sent questions today had asked about something similar, but the part about informed consent, which states that the research procedure, their purposes, risks, anticipated benefits, alternative procedures, the subject must know all these things. So the question is, if we find ourselves trying to develop a psychological study that involves human subjects, and we realize that informing them of the study's purpose or any other particular could bias the data, Is it accepted not to inform them until after the study? Additionally, what will be the procedure to get the project approved and properly funded?
Yeah, so I can answer that. So that's what we call deception. And it really depends on, again, the weighing of the benefits and the risks. In psychological research, the primary risks are emotional discomfort or psychological harm. If you have to do deception to avoid these kinds of problems and successfully carry out your research, you need to be able to justify it. If the potential harm is not very great, and you debrief the person immediately afterwards, then usually the institutional review board who does the ethics review will let you do it. Again, if they feel that it's not going to create additional harm. And what you should do in terms of letting them know on the consent, you tell as much as you can. Maybe you don't tell your specific hypothesis, but you say what general area you're looking at and what they will be asked to do and whether they might feel some psychological discomfort or not. But for mild, minimal risk studies is what we term them, mild deception, you have to acknowledge it in your application for the review. But if it's justified and unlikely to do additional harm, then oftentimes it will be approved.
Thanks. A couple of students have reached out wanting to learn more. They're excited to get a head start on this training. What resources do any of you recommend for beginning this journey into responsible content research?
Again, and maybe I'll type these in too. So there's two that come to mind. One is a video series called the Office of Research Integrity, which oversees a lot of this. They have a great website with a lot of different resources on it, ORI. One of the resources is an interactive video called The Lab, where you can actually role play. This is not so much human subjects research, but the other type of RCR about falsifying data, which we haven't talked about so much. So the video series called The Lab lets you role play and find out about some of these things. And then National Academies of Science have a booklet with a bunch of different scenarios called On Being a Scientist. And you can just Google either of those and find out. And then of course, like I said, reading the Belmont report. I read it periodically just to refresh myself. I know I'm a geeky person that way, but I think it's an excellent resource. I'll type those links in.
I would say I would absolutely underline the idea of reading and rereading the Belmont report. I think partly for some of the reasons that Professor Vogt was talking about. The report content feels a little different at different stages in your research as you learn more about the particular ways that you're going to be working with human subjects or animals or whatever. And so I do get required to reread the Belmont report every time my IRB credentials are renewed, and so I have to do it, but I also desire to do it because of the ways that it kind of takes on a different relevance for the different projects that I run. So I would underscore that. I also did include a couple of references for what I was saying about multiculturally valid research. One is Kirkham, that's listed, and there are a couple of others. I could post them into the chat if that would be better. Will, you can let me know, but I would recommend taking a look at some of the key readings from the American Journal of Evaluation on what culturally responsive research is and how to look at general principles that might be able to be applied to a particular research project. There are some good interactive videos online from the Oregon State University that are really good for giving you information on this.
And I would just quickly second the suggestion for the ORI website. I think that even beyond that, the lab video, there's a huge amount of content there. The one thing that I will add to that is that talking with people about these things is very important, because one of the things that can be very frustrating to young scientists in the context of responsible conduct of research training is that there's not always a black and white answer. It's not like you can point to read a case and everybody agrees on what the right answer is. And so talking through things is not only essential, it's the reason that the NIH structures these trainings the way that they do, where a lot of it has to be through face-to-face communication, because there's no textbook that says, okay, here's a scenario, here's what you do. Here's a scenario, here's what you do, because the answers are not always that clear.
I'll just jump in here as well. So here at Cornell, for the last number of years, we've had undergraduate training once a year. It's a half day. We make up or get from the literature. There's lots of places to get this, these hypothetical cases that are not black and white. They're gray. And there's a talk, someone gives a talk like me, maybe another person on the principles, and then the undergrads, there's usually about 100 of them, break or something like that. They break into groups of 8 or 10 or 12, led by a senior grad student, and they have this hour-and-a-half discussion. And we find that works really well to get, because undergrads, you guys, you need to discuss this. You need to verbalize. You can't just read it and absorb it. It's not that way. You have to express yourself to others. And anyway, it works really well. And I think eventually maybe more undergrad universities will also do this for the undergrads. Common for grad students, not so common for undergrads, I guess. Do it. You undergrads, go home and arrange it, push someone to start a series like that at your own college or university.
So thank you, everyone. We're just about out of time, and I'm actually going to take a moderator prerogative to share a few comments, because some people asked me about what my background was and why I'm here. So, and this actually dovetails with the question of what would you tell your undergraduate researcher. So as a political theorist, I thought RCR doesn't apply to me at all, because I'm reading texts that have been published by scholars, 100 years ago. There's no person to harm. They wanted their material out there. I'm reading it and interpreting it. Political theory is also deeply involved with ethics, and it started to become very relevant when I was having conversations with colleagues who were dealing with human subjects, who were dealing with areas of possible harm, and these big open questions of, what does autonomy mean? What does harm mean? What is justice? What is beneficence? Whose stories are we respecting and whose stories aren't we respecting? So really, any academic discipline has a really important role to play in keeping the conduct of the research enterprise responsible, ethical, and culturally responsive. So I encourage everyone in every discipline to be part of these conversations. I'm really just echoing the panelists here, but I wanted to take a moment to do that. We will be posting the materials that our panelists have mentioned in the Google Classroom. Many of you have additional questions for our panelists. We will be sharing a means to get in touch with each of them if you'd like to forward that directly, or if you wanted to forward a question to me or to Sam Anderson, and they can get that question answered that way. So once again, thank you for taking time out of a very busy summer for this. That's for both our viewers out there and to our panelists. I know we won't be able to hear you, but a round of applause for our 4 wonderful panelists, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.